Last week I spoke at the end of the homily on a few aspects of the vaccine mandates that humanity is facing around the world and could well come in further force in New Zealand. So if you haven't seen some of the words that I spoke there, it's worth, I think, going to have a look at. If you want to scroll back through my Facebook page history and find the Sunday Mass from last week and have a listen to some of those things that I spoke on regarding freedom of conscience and freedom of choice and informed consent and the way in which the state needs to respect those things when it comes to this pandemic and these vaccines. There's a couple of extra things I would like to just add for clarification purposes, but also to bring a little bit more light to bear on what I said last week. As I mentioned, the Vatican had put out a document regarding the administration of the COVID-19 vaccines, a very short document, but in it, in its final paragraphs, it laid out what were the principles and the criteria under which and from which the vaccines can be administered in the civil realm. And it's clear that it says the questions to be asked are, is it necessary? Is it safe? Is it effective? Is it the only way? Meaning, is it the only means? And is it voluntary? And they are questions that we should all be looking at and asking freely, their own intelligence, and trying to do the best research that we can to see whether and what the answers to those questions are. And the second part of the homily last week are not only addressed in the first part, the mandates, but the second part was looking at the coercion and the single narrative that's being spun by not only governments and politicians, but by the media and then other medical institutions. And we have to be very aware of that. For those who are not aware of this, this has been running for some time in politics, in various areas around the world, in the universities and other institutions, where freedom of thought, freedom of inquiry, of research on many controversial matters has been shut down. You just need to look at the social sciences in the universities where dissenting opinions from the current narrative, the liberal, woke, leftist narrative, are not allowed. And often professors have been gagged, and then the media are running the same kind of single narrative to push a certain social control, social engineering. And that's important to understand because this is not something that has just risen now with the vaccines and COVID. It's been running for a number of decades. So it's not surprising and it's not controversial to say it, that there is and can be, and we have to be very aware of it, a certain controlling narrative by which the media does not give the full truth on certain things. And so it's incumbent upon us to exercise our intelligence and our freedom of conscience, to search further than just what is fed up to us on the nightly news or in the mainstream media or by the politicians who stand at the pulpits. And if someone is thinking in their mind that surely politicians wouldn't lie, surely people wouldn't lie, well then I would say to you, wake up. The whole world and its whole history has been full of situations where political situations have been governed by lies. Now, I'm not saying people are deliberately lying, or particular people, or in particular instances. I'm just saying that we need to make sure that we gain a certain freedom. I think one of the tyrannies, the greatest tyranny that's running at the moment, is the control that the mainstream media exercises on populations around the world. It is an empire by which so many people have their brains sucked out of their head into the television screen or the internet screen, just believing whatever is fed to them by people who control the mainstream media institutions. And we have to try very hard to maintain an intellectual independence, maintain the dignity of our intelligence from this control that's been running for many decades now. And this COVID business is just another step by which single narratives are run and a single means is being offered by which it can be solved. Let us make sure we continue to pursue a certain independence. Last night I shared on my Facebook page a fantastic discussion from about 8 or 9 medical experts who are commenting on the virus, the vaccines, and the different ways in which therapy is being given to those who are ill with the virus. And these are not armchair critics. These are not theoreticians who sit in their university offices and opine from a distance. These are people with now huge clinical experience in treating COVID, thousands of patients under their care who are speaking independently and raising legitimate scientific questions, legitimate questions that should be asked. And there we should do everything we can to try to inform our own conscience. What to do, and this was something I wanted to address last week but didn't have the time. If we are in a situation where we're doing our research, we're trying to inform our conscience, to inform our prudence, weighing up things, and we have an employer that places us under pressure to get the vaccine, how do we proceed? I mentioned last week, I think that it's very clear from the natural moral law, from the teaching of the church, and from other coded documents that have been rightly and authentically put together in the recent history for the medical fields, that vaccine mandates are immoral. To be forced to put an injection into your arm and put in a situation where you feel you have no choice and you have to choose this because you don't want to lose this is something that is illegitimate in society from the state, and I think it's also illegitimate coming from employers when there is already an employment contract signed. Some employers, it might be okay in certain situations where they kind of say, we want you in this situation to take a medicine before you get the job. At least the person has the freedom there. Although there will be certain situations where that's not legitimate, when the whole field, that whole line of work mandates that. I don't think that would be right to inspect every prospective employee to have to stick a needle in their arm and take a vaccine where we don't have the full knowledge on how safe it is. And if you're wondering about that question, how safe it is, look at that video that I shared last night. If you're wondering about its effectiveness, look at that video that I shared last night. If you're wondering whether it's truly necessary, have a look at that video that I shared last night. And I'm not saying it gives all the answers or that I subscribe to everything that's said. It is simply that we should be looking to further broaden our perspective than what is currently being sold. So for a person who's put in a situation where their employer says you must take the vaccine or you're going to lose your job, the person then has to do basically a risk-benefit analysis on the situation. A single person who's doing a job that they don't quite care for and they really want to maintain their independence of conscience and thought and intelligence will just say, fine, I'm resigning and I'm getting a job somewhere else. And that's perfectly legitimate to do so. Another person who is in their most preferred line of work and they've spent many years studying to do this line of work and they have many other things, goods to protect, for example, they've got a mortgage to pay, 5 dependent children and a wife, and they want to continue doing the work because it still does a lot of good. Let's say they're a doctor. They have these options before them, I suppose, as they try to break free and be independent and set up their own clinic and do the same work but outside of those coercive mechanisms. And this is a whole weighing up game that goes on between the goods and the evils, between the risks and the benefits. But it might come to a situation where a number of people, and priests might be in this situation, where for the sake of greater goods, one will tolerate and submit to the vaccine, even though they don't like it, for the sake of either maintaining a union with certain goods or continuing in them in various ways. So for example, a priest, if they're going to be forced by going into the hospitals to get the vaccine, they don't like it, they don't agree with it, they're willing to take the risk, which they measure up the risk to their own health, and the risk of giving way and giving power to an employer in such a way which is illegitimate, in order to be able to bring the divine life to people through the sacraments, help them as they're dying, serve them in a spiritual capacity. And that is a weighing up that may go on. And that is a legitimate weighing up, because the vaccine is not an intrinsic evil. One can indeed do this analysis and might come to that conclusion that in one's conscience, one will do this in order to continue administering other goods and safeguarding other goods. And that is personal for each person. It's a prudence that they must weigh up. It is according to their own assessment of those goods and evils and risks and benefits. And that's hard. That puts people in a situation they don't want to be in, and they might sense deep frustration and anger because of it, but it might just be one of those things that we have to live with today. We already do it in other areas. In lesser areas, for example, paying taxes. We have to pay taxes. Much of that money goes to things that we don't support. Homosexual agenda, the transgender thing that's going on, abortion, other things which we do not agree with. And it makes us annoyed that the hard-earned money that people will have goes to pay for such things, but there's not much that they can do, and they submit to that, they accept that, because there are other goods to be maintained. First of all, not being prosecuted for not paying one's taxes, but also that the money, some of the monies goes to other decent things in society for the common good. And that might be the case here, but obviously the vast difference, and it's a huge difference, it's one thing to pay money, which is an external thing. It's quite another thing to accept that a needle goes into one's arm and administers a drug that one has certain doubts about or lack of knowledge on and has some concerns about one's own health on. But that is definitely a weighing up that can be done legitimately so. And each person has to do that, and they can get the best advice that they can from people they trust as to how they might proceed. And that's legitimate to do so. It's concerning that there are people in the church now, high-level people, who have actually put in place these mandates, including for worship and coming to church, that one has to prove that they're vaccinated before they can worship. I believe this is utterly immoral and sinful to do so. I don't think there's any situation where this can be maintained. And I find it highly ironic that in a time where pro-abortion politicians who are vociferously and deliberately for abortion in all the ways that they've voted throughout their entire political career and who are Catholic, we are told that they must be given communion and there'll be no segregation, no delineation between them and the public scandal and the way in which they lead other people into error and the way they affect the common good in the church and in society. We ignore all of that and the spiritual health or lack of health that they might have, and we administer Holy Communion to them. And at the same time, these very same people are saying that based on bodily health, we must cut certain people out from the church because of the way they could affect the common good and affect the health of others. I find this to be an enormous and deep contradiction in the way that the church is looking at things. And I think it manifests a deep spiritual sickness in the church, where we are more concerned with bodily health than we are with spiritual health, and we will put the body and put segregation in at the bodily level, and we seem to have no understanding of how spiritual sickness can spread in the church and how we must have a concern for the spiritual good and the common good of the church at the spiritual level, and how heresy and confusion and so many things, the viruses at the spiritual level, spread and run rampant. Yet there seems to be no correction, no wanting to stop this for the sake of the eternal destiny of souls, and yet we will put in the most obstructive measures to stop people coming into the church, being part of the worshipping community, based on the possibility of illness at the level of the body. This shows a diabolical disorientation in the church, in my opinion, where we do not have things in the right priority and the right order. And I think that we all must be on our knees, all of us, asking the Lord for light to show us what the priorities are in this difficulty, in this crisis that the world is facing. I will finish there because I don't want to drag on and burden people too much more than I already have. My apologies. But please do have a look at the video that I've shared, and also have a look at the homily from last week if you missed it, because there's a number of important things there that I've laid out. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.